Television history had never seen anything like it. Johnny Carson, the king of late-night television, suddenly stopped mid-sentence during his monologue. His eyes locked onto something in the guest area. The entire NBC studio fell silent. 40 million Americans watching at home leaned forward in their chairs. Because what happened next would change everything they thought they knew about the man who had entertained them for decades. Carson slowly placed his index cards down on the desk. His usual confident smile vanished. The cameras kept rolling, but something was terribly wrong. In the guest chair, Tony Curtis, Hollywood legend, heartthrob of millions, was slumping forward, his face pale as paper. "Ladies and gentlemen," Carson said, his voice barely above a whisper. "We need to—" He couldn't finish the sentence. For the first time in his career, Johnny Carson had no words. But what he did next would prove that sometimes the greatest show is knowing when to stop the show entirely. How did we get to this moment? How did America's most composed entertainer find himself frozen in front of the entire nation? The answer begins 3 hours earlier, in a dressing room where Tony Curtis was fighting the biggest battle of his life. It was March 15, 1978. The Tonight Show starring Johnny Carson was at its absolute peak. Carson commanded the night. When Johnny talked, America listened. When Johnny laughed, America laughed with him. He was more than a talk show host, he was a national institution. That particular Tuesday evening started like any other. Carson arrived at Studio 6B in Burbank at 4:30 p.m., exactly as he had for the past 16 years. His ritual was sacred. Review the monologue jokes with the writers, check the guest lineup, practice his golf swing in the hallway, and mentally prepare for another 90 minutes of controlled chaos. Ed McMahon was already in makeup, reading through his cue cards and warming up his legendary laugh. Doc Severinsen was tuning his trumpet with the Tonight Show band, their instruments gleaming under the studio lights. The massive NBC cameras were being positioned, their red recording lights still dark. In dressing room 3, Tony Curtis sat alone. At 52, Curtis was still strikingly handsome, but the years had taken their toll. His marriage to Leslie Allen was crumbling. His relationship with his daughters from previous marriages was strained. The pills that had started as medication for back pain had become something else entirely, a crutch he couldn't seem to let go of. Curtis had been scheduled to appear on The Tonight Show to promote his new film, but that wasn't really why he was there. He was there because his publicist insisted it would humanize him after months of tabloid headlines about his personal struggles. What neither his publicist nor the Tonight Show producers knew was that Curtis hadn't slept in 3 days. At 5 p.m., Carson made his usual pre-show rounds, stopping by each guest's dressing room for a brief chat. It was part show business diplomacy, part genuine curiosity about the people who would share his stage. When Carson knocked on Curtis's door, he immediately noticed something wasn't right. Curtis's hands were shaking slightly as he reached for a cup of coffee that had gone cold hours earlier. His famous blue eyes seemed distant, unfocused. "Tony, you feeling all right?" Carson asked, his performer's instincts picking up on subtle signals that something was off. "Just tired, Johnny. You know how it is." Curtis forced a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Ready to give them a good show?" Carson studied him for a moment longer. In 16 years of hosting The Tonight Show, he had developed an almost supernatural ability to read people. Something about Curtis's energy felt fragile, like glass that had already cracked but hadn't yet shattered. "Take your time out there, Tony. No pressure. We're just going to have a conversation." At 5:30 p.m., the studio audience began filing into their seats. 300 people who had waited in line for hours, some traveling from across the country just to see Johnny Carson live. They chattered excitedly, pointing at the famous desk, the guest chairs, the spot where in 90 minutes, television magic would happen. Carson stopped mid-monologue. The entire studio froze. The show began at 11:30 p.m. Eastern, 8:30 p.m. Pacific, with Carson's trademark entrance through the rainbow curtain. The audience erupted in applause, as they always did. Ed McMahon's voice boomed across the nation. "Here's Johnny!" Carson delivered his monologue with the precision of a master craftsman. Jokes about President Carter, the gas shortage, the latest Hollywood gossip. Each punchline landed perfectly, each pause timed to the millisecond. For the first 20 minutes, it was classic Carson, smooth, confident, in complete control. During the commercial break before the first guest segment, Carson glanced over at Tony Curtis, who was sitting in the green room area visible from the stage. Curtis was gripping the arms of his chair, his knuckles white. A bead of sweat had formed on his forehead despite the studio's air conditioning. Something was wrong. Carson had a choice to make. He could proceed with the show as planned, hoping Curtis would pull through whatever was happening to him. Or he could trust his instincts and prepare for something unprecedented. When they came back from commercial, Carson introduced Curtis with his usual warmth. "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome one of Hollywood's greatest stars, Tony Curtis." The audience applauded enthusiastically as Curtis walked to the guest chair, his smile brilliant under the studio lights. For a moment, it seemed like everything would be fine. Curtis was, after all, a professional who had been performing for 3 decades. They talked about Curtis's new film, his early days in Hollywood, his famous roles in Some Like It Hot and Spartacus. Curtis's answers were charming, if a bit slow. Carson compensated masterfully, filling any awkward pauses with perfectly timed questions and gentle humor. But Carson never took his eyes off his guest's face. He saw the subtle signs that the studio audience missed. The slight tremor in Curtis's hands, the way he kept blinking as if trying to clear his vision, the careful way he was choosing his words. 15 minutes into the interview it happened. Curtis was in the middle of telling a story about working with Cary Grant when his voice simply stopped. Not like he had forgotten his words, but like his body had forgotten how to make words. He sat there for what felt like an eternity but was probably only 3 seconds, his mouth slightly open, his eyes suddenly confused and frightened. Carson leaned forward slightly. "Tony?" Curtis tried to speak again, but instead of words, only a soft, strangled sound came out. His face had gone pale, almost gray under the studio lights. His breathing became shallow and rapid. Backstage, he made a choice no producer would have ever allowed. Carson immediately understood what was happening. Whether it was exhaustion, medication, panic, or some combination of all three, Tony Curtis was in crisis. On live television. In front of 40 million people. In that moment, Carson had several options. He could call for a commercial break and hope the director would cut away quickly enough. He could make a joke to cover the moment, and try to carry Curtis through it. He could signal for help from the production team. Instead, Johnny Carson did something that had never been done in the history of network television. He stood up from behind his desk. The action was so unexpected, so contrary to the rigid structure of late-night television, that it sent a shock wave through the studio. The audience, sensing something monumental was happening but not understanding what, fell completely silent. Carson walked around his desk, moving slowly and deliberately toward Tony Curtis. The cameras followed him, unsure what else to do. In the control room, producer Fred de Cordova was frantically signaling to the director, but Carson's actions were so unprecedented that no one knew how to respond. "Tony," Carson said softly, now standing directly in front of his guest. "It's okay. You're safe here." Curtis looked up at Carson, his famous blue eyes now filled with a vulnerability that was heartbreaking to witness. In that moment, he wasn't Tony Curtis the movie star. He wasn't the heartthrob who had charmed audiences for 30 years. He was just a man who was struggling, and afraid, and very much alone. Carson did something then that no talk show host had ever done. He reached out and gently placed his hand on Curtis's shoulder. "Folks," Carson said, turning slightly toward the camera but keeping his hand on Curtis. "Sometimes we all need a moment to catch our breath. Tony's been working incredibly hard, and I think we should just give him that moment." The studio remained absolutely silent. 40 million Americans watching at home were witnessing something unprecedented, genuine human compassion on live television. Carson looked down at Curtis and asked quietly, "What do you need?" Curtis, his voice barely audible, whispered, I can't. Johnny, I'm scared." It was the most honest moment in television history. Carson nodded, understanding immediately. Without another word, he walked to his desk and picked up a glass of water. He brought it back to Curtis, who accepted it with trembling hands. "Take all the time you need," Carson said. "We've got nowhere else to be." And then Carson did something that would become legendary in television lore. He sat down on the edge of his desk, facing Curtis, and simply waited. The cameras kept rolling. The audience sat in respectful silence. America watched as their most beloved entertainer proved that kindness was more important than keeping a show on schedule. After what felt like an eternity but was probably only 2 minutes, Curtis took a deep breath and looked up at Carson. "I'm sorry," Curtis said. "For what?" Carson replied. "For being human?" But this was the moment no one in the studio, nor anyone at home, ever saw coming. Curtis began to cry. Not the theatrical tears of a movie star, but the raw, exhausted tears of a man who had been pretending to be okay for too long. And Carson, this master of timing and control, simply sat there and let it happen. In the control room, executives were panicking. This wasn't television. This was real life, messy and unpredictable and completely off script. But Carson had made his choice, and the cameras kept rolling. "You know what, Johnny?" Curtis said, his voice stronger now but still shaky. "I've been pretending so long, I forgot how to stop." Carson nodded. "We all pretend sometimes, Tony. But not here. Not tonight." Curtis took another sip of water and looked out at the studio audience. 300 people who had come to be entertained were instead witnessing something much more valuable, authentic human connection. "I've been taking pills," Curtis said suddenly, his voice carrying clearly through the studio. "For pain, at first. But then they became the pain." The audience remained silent, but there was no judgment in their silence. Only attention and compassion, and the recognition that they were witnessing something important. Carson never moved from his position on the edge of his desk. "What do you want to do about that, Tony?" "I want to get better," Curtis said, and for the first time all evening, his voice was clear and strong. "I want to remember who I am when I'm not pretending." Carson smiled then, the genuine smile that had made him America's favorite host. "That's the best answer you've given all night." The audience erupted in applause, not the polite, automatic applause of a television show, but the deep, sustained applause of people who had just witnessed something true and beautiful and rare. Subscribe and leave a comment, because the most powerful part of this story is still ahead. Carson stood up and extended his hand to Curtis, who took it and stood as well. They embraced briefly, and in that embrace was everything that television could be at its best. Not just entertainment, but connection, not just performance, but truth. "Ladies and gentlemen," Carson said, turning to address both the studio audience and the cameras, "what you've just seen is why I love doing this show. Not for the laughs, not for the ratings, but for moments like this when we remember that we're all just people trying to figure it out together." The show didn't continue with its planned format. Instead, Carson and Curtis sat and talked for another 20 minutes. About recovery, about fear, about the pressure of public life, about the courage it takes to ask for help. It was the most watched segment in tonight's show history. When the show ended, Carson walked Curtis personally to his dressing room. They talked for another hour about treatment options, about the support Curtis would need, about the hard work that lay ahead. That night changed both men's lives. Tony Curtis entered treatment the following week. It wasn't easy, recovery never is. But he had taken the first step by telling the truth in front of 40 million witnesses. He would later credit that tonight's show appearance with saving his life. Carson, meanwhile, had discovered something about his own power as a broadcaster. It wasn't just his ability to make people laugh that mattered. It was his ability to create space for truth, for vulnerability, for the full spectrum of human experience. Years later, when Carson retired, he kept a single item from that night on his desk at home: the index cards from his monologue, the ones he had set down when he saw Tony Curtis struggling. On the back of the last card, he had written 3 words: "Show must pause." Because sometimes, the greatest show is knowing when to stop performing and start caring. Share and subscribe. Make sure this story is never forgotten.